What's up, everybody? CJ Maurer here with The Gist, and I am super excited to be talking to my longtime friend, college teammate, college roommate, and forensic accountant in Washington, D.C., Chris Ekimoff. Chris, how's it going?
Great to see you. And I like the way you ordered that list of modifiers for who I am, because I think college teammate, roommate, and then forensic accountant is a good way to prioritize how I rank in the world.
I am way more in touch with you now because of our history in college than
100%.
I am your decided profession.
Yeah, I mean, our wives joke that we're work husbands, even though we don't work for the same company or interact in a super professional setting.
Or even remotely the same industry.
Exactly.
Remotely the same industry. So Chris told me that I needed to start with why, my why, at the beginning of this podcast, because little fun fact, Chris, a lot of people have seen the famous Simon Sinek TEDx video where he did the golden circle and start with why. Chris, I remember when you posted on social media a couple of years ago that you met him. How did you meet him?
Yeah, so he was serving on a panel for a very nuanced segment of a conference for what the AICPA puts on, the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, National Advocacy, membership association for CPAs. The digital CPA conference is kind of a forward-thinking, or at least was when it started 10 years ago, really cutting-edge view of how accountants need to transition from the green visors and the 14-column worksheets to a more digital presence, and being a thought leader in kind of not only the futurist thinking that Simon Sinek talks about, but also just how to take that CPA mentality across mediums is really where we served on the panel together. So I was kind of in the younger set, kind of representing a little bit of the younger generation, along with some other problem solvers on that panel, who've streamlined third-party billing processes and payroll solutions and things like that. So very kind of wonky, but he was, I don't want to downplay my own participation in the panel. He was definitely the guy that everybody came to see.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's like the second most viewed TED Talk video of all time. I think, wow. I want to say this was probably a couple years ago when I read this. If my memory serves me correctly, it was Sir Ken Robinson did a TED Talk about how schools are killing creativity in children. Mm-hmm. And then I think Simon Sinek's from Puget Sound with the golden circle and start with why was number 2.
That's endearing to me. That fills me up, CJ, because the way the internet is, it's good to hear that the TED Talks are the most watched TED Talks are about meaningful things instead of, God knows what else is going on out there in the internet.
Right.
So,
well, since you encouraged me to start with my why, this is kind of interesting because this is a quote unquote podcast. Mm-hmm. I always have to disclaim it because it doesn't have a name and it doesn't have a strategy yet. I recently started my own business a handful of months ago, and that required a lot of planning and strategy. And my clients hire me to, create marketing campaigns, content, and a whole bunch of other things to help them grow. And all of those things usually require a significant amount of planning and strategy and whyification of everything, whether, I'm just pitching my clients on how to do things or then going about and actually doing them. And so for me, I saw this as an opportunity to be refreshingly unplanned.
Yeah.
I think through the casual nature of this series, I think a why so far has revealed itself, which is really just, I'm doing it because I can. I'm doing it because it's fun, with the hopes that, by having interesting conversations with interesting people, other people might like it, whether that's, 1,000 people or 100 people or 10 people. And I'm okay with that because right now it's fun and I can do it. And I think the larger point is that, is to do something. I think it's healthy to do something, not because you have to or because there is a particular incentive for you, but I believe in the practice of doing something simply because you can. And that's why this has been really, really fun for me. And I would say that is my why right now.
Yeah. I think, too, CJ, and a lot of the efforts and the topics that you focus on in your business, you say, find your voice. And I always harken back. There's a great, I'll try to send you a link if I can find the podcast itself, a great discussion that I think Malcolm Gladwell was a member of, where he was talking about the value of the tone and timbre of an individual's voice and storytelling. Obviously, Malcolm Gladwell has written New York Times bestsellers, international, whirlwinds of thought and everything. But even he was saying, I'm limited in writing a book. I can only put words on the page to describe what's happening, when I can, talk to you about the salty dog that came in off the fishing boat. But to hear him speak and tell that story after a long day is so much more meaningful, right? So exploring this medium, I think for you specifically, CJ, and all the enthusiasm that you bring to the work that you do, it's a natural extension of who you are and where you're going. So I'm excited to be a part of it.
Thank you. Well, one of the reasons why I asked you to do this is not just because I thought you would have no choice but to say yes, because we're friends.
Classic.
Is also because a couple of things. One, you work in a completely different line of work from me, which I find interesting. And two, you have a little bit of a history now of being a content producer in your own right. So before we talk about that, why don't you share with everybody who's watching, however many people who's watching and listening, what you do for work?
Yeah, so CJ, you kind of queued it up, forensic accountant, which is a sexy phrase to describe what we try to accomplish in our line of work. In the accounting world, there's a variety of different services. You do your tax preparation, you've got annual audits, compilations, you do all kinds of different, either regular or ad hoc type work. Forensic accounting is nuanced because I like to describe it that it is any time that financial information requires a heightened level of scrutiny. And you get an audit done every year if you're a major company, or even if you're getting your audit done for your bank. That's something that happens regularly, and there's the appropriate amount of scrutiny applied to that on a regular basis. Hey, let's make sure your things are in order, on every quarter or every year. The forensic accounting piece is really, we've got a problem. I use the phrase Humpty Dumpty has fallen off the wall. We're being sued. We're being pursued by a regulator related to a very specific accounting or finance issue. We need specialized and focused help. So in the, age-old axiom, it is not a mile wide and an inch deep. It is an inch wide and a mile deep. We're looking at a very specific issue, to almost 100% of a degree. So, for example, we were hired last year, a group of colleagues and I were hired to help a company understand why very specific inventory reserves were basically falling out of whack. They had a certain amount of product in their warehouse that they thought was worth $100. But then at the end of the quarter, they did all their accounting and lined up what the inventory was worth at the beginning of the quarter and the end of the quarter, and the numbers didn't make sense. The company's doing fine. They're selling the inventory they need to sell. Their customers are happy. They don't get from a books and records standpoint why things are going wrong. So Chris and his team come in. We look very detailed at all of the inventory in the warehouse. We look at the systems that are happening to account for that inventory. We try to help them understand what, if anything's going wrong in the assumptions they're putting into their systems, in the operation of those systems, or in the value of their inventory. So very small example kind of on what we call the consulting side for forensic accounting. The flip side of that, and where I know, CJ, you always ask me a lot of great questions about, is the courtroom side. You get a fraud investigation, an allegation of abuse or misappropriation of assets. Guys like me get hired to sit on a stand and to testify as an expert in a court of law to help the jury or the judge understand very technical accounting issues. Everybody knows what a Ponzi scheme is, right? But when it comes down to a court of law, how do you prove that the individual was actually operating a Ponzi scheme and defrauding investors, or just making bad investment decisions and trying to cover his losses? There's kind of a gray area there that courts of law, attorneys, and clients are very interested in exploring from a financial perspective. And that's kind of where I get into it. So a lot of very sexy and cool words. And I always try to backpedal a bit and say, guys, I am also staring at a computer screen for 10 hours a day, just like my accounting brethren in audit and tax. But that's kind of a good rundown of the type of work I do on a regular basis.
On a scale of 1 to 10, how nervous are you to testify in a courtroom?
I think if it's not a 10 out of 10 every time, you're either not prepared or you're not looking at the situation right. Oftentimes, you kind of find yourselves in the tail ends of experience, and that the legal case will either be so supremely focused on accounting and financial issues that it all hinges on the testimony of two kind of they call war of the experts, right? My expert says it's 10, your expert says it's 5, let's duke it out. Or the other side of the spectrum is there are so many legal machinations in between the way the contract is written, or the lawsuit was filed, or the other witnesses that are involved. And maybe everybody agrees the accounting was wrong, but nobody knows who did the wrong accounting. right? That's less of a spectrum, less of an emphasis on Chris's specific activity and work as an expert, and more so on kind of the general facts and circumstances of the case. So as long as you understand where you fall on that spectrum, it can help manage the nerves. But I mean, you're sitting in a place to be asked questions that the other side wants you to get wrong. That's a tough nut to crack.
So I like your analogy about an inch wide and a mile deep. It would stand to reason that perhaps although, in the financial accounting world, what you represent, what you do represents a smaller percentage of professionals, but it stands to reason that maybe that same analogy applies for how unique it is and how potentially other people within your line of work might engage with it. I know that you started producing content or curating content in the past, getting on social media, which at the time I don't think a lot of accountants were doing some email marketing. How did that work for you, and how have you noticed that any of those efforts have informed where you are now in your career?
Yeah, so I kind of got into the social media craze, if you will, back in the early 20-teens, mainly to interact with news services and courts of law and attorneys that I knew that were operating the space. Part of my job as a consultant, basically as a litigation consultant, is to know what's going on in the market, what other cases are happening that have similar fact patterns to cases I might be working on. So I relied on social media and some of the more broad-based marketing avenues for competitors and potential clients to inform me of that. And I realized that I was kind of in a very nuanced group of content consumers. I'm interested in the Wall Street Journal, but I don't really care about the foreign currency exchange price between the euro and the dollar. I care much more about the instances of executive financial statement fraud than maybe somebody else does who's in Forex trading, right? So I would take those pieces of content from the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and the Washington Post and kind of focus more on those. And then I would also be following attorneys generally, but mainly white collar crime defense, government investigations, and trial litigators, more so than M&A attorneys or corporate guys who also do great work, but just isn't in my purview. So that really kind of supported me in saying, Chris, get out there, read this stuff, but also share what's interesting to you, because that's going to help identify in those mediums ways for potential clients, other collaborators, good friends from college, to understand in kind of a crib sheet what you're interested in and what you're focused on, to really narrow that down. So that's kind of how I got started in it. And it's really just been a handful of tweets a day for, 8-9 years now. But it's given me the foundation and the comfort to explore a lot of other, content creation applications as well. The easiest example I give, if you guys are Netflix fans out there, the documentary series Dirty Money just came out with its second season, where they kind of focus on a very specific set of court filings, documents, and potential fraud cases that have gone on in the past few years. Me and my staff, we kind of write up a quick summary of that documentary, and then we support that with all of the underpinning, open source legal documents related to that. So they say, the defendant pled guilty. We'll give you a link to the guilty plea. So if you're a person who's interested in, I remember from season 1, the maple syrup pricing conglomerate or cartel up in Canada. Very cool story, both from a breakfast perspective as well as from a forensic accounting perspective. Getting to read those documents might be interesting to you, or you might just like to watch the 45 minutes on the documentary and then flip back to reruns of Parks and Rec. So we kind of wanted to give that service to folks who wanted to get to that next level and review those things. So one of the examples, CJ, I know that we've talked about related to some of the content I try to put out there in the world for interaction.
Yeah. For me, it would be going back to reruns of The Office, mainly because I think one, I love it, but also it's apparently leaving Netflix at the end of 2020 because NBC is coming out with its own streaming platforms.
Yeah, that's right.
For you Office fans, get your Office binging while you can. Hopefully you have to go to another platform. But yeah, that's a great example, and that's really cool. So I also know that you've started a podcast. So give me the backstory of what led you to starting your podcast.
So I'm going to try to say this in the least nerdy way possible. I met a guy who's a good friend of mine now through Twitter at a securities enforcement conference. Okay, I guess I didn't do a good job of explaining that in a non-nerdy way. But for those of you who go out and hit the conference circuit, again, in times outside of global pandemics, we used to get together, and oftentimes the conference would support a hashtag. So if you saw something interesting or caught a quote, you'd share it on Twitter and hashtag Securities Conference. There were basically only two of us at this conference interacting about 3 or 4 years ago. And my good friend now, Kurt Wolf, and I got to meet each other at the networking happy hour afterwards and kind of identified kindred spirits in each other, and that we were interested in overlapping issues in the securities enforcement and forensic accounting space, but did very different things. So we often had great conversations about this. Ended up getting in touch with a legal education service called PLI, the Practicing Law Institute, and discussing efforts that we could do together to collaborate, not only to share, Chris's personal brand as well as the companies and firms that I work for and with, but also how to give PLI something that maybe they aren't offering their 300,000 attorney members at the time. And we kind of married that up with the idea of a podcast. So I posited with, Kurt and Chris spend all this time tweeting at each other about arcane securities law. Why not just put a microphone down and have that conversation out loud? And so we started looking into that in the spring of 2019 and launched our first episode in January of 2020 through PLI, who has a great staff in terms of production, editing, content development, and things like that. So by no means a lift of just Kurt and me. But to your point, CJ, in starting this podcast, Kurt and I spent about 10 months planning what our episodes were going to be like. And then by the end of the second episode said, crap, we got to do something different. This isn't fitting. So I think you're taking a much more level-headed view of where we should go and what you should focus on than all that prep work that's turned into what I think is a very interesting conversation we're having, but very different than what we planned.
Yeah, I kind of intuited that. I think the best way to learn is by doing. You can't learn how to ride a bike by watching YouTube videos. So I kind of came in with a similar mindset. I don't have the luxury of spending 10 months planning and strategizing a podcast right now.
Of course.
The business to run, thankfully it's doing well. I'm adding clients, right? I'm figuring out how to grow and scale responsibly. Also, I have 2 little kids at home plus a pandemic, and then it's like, okay, maybe I need to be efficient with my time. And so yeah, plus for all the reasons why I said, I'm just winging this. All right. So stop asking so many questions. No. No, that's cool. So tell me about why you felt like you had to pivot after 1 or 2 episodes.
We had it in our minds that we were going to be able to provide insight beyond, the legal cases and the headlines. And we found that we became just another voice in the cacophony of voices responding to the most recent announcement from the Bernie Madoff case or the last big FCPA settlement. Other news outlets and things were already covering that way better than we were in a faster time period and with more journalistic gravitas than 2 guys in a microphone could do. We saw that the conversations we were having with others in the industry were really diving into not only the insights related to those specific cases, but some of the guiding dynamics to that. So not only what happened with company ABC when they settled with the Department of Justice, but how has the Department of Justice changed its posture in the past 5 or 10 years to foreign bribery or corruption overseas? And getting guests on that have had experience either with those specific cases or in the market generally, as well as Kurt and I having served on some of those, facts and circumstances based cases. That was a much more fulsome and interesting discussion for us. And I think PLI agrees, in terms of not just reading back the news to people, but providing a deeper conversation. It's gone much more that way. So turns out I don't think we were as smart as we thought we were, but we're still, finding our way to provide some interesting insight, hopefully, to our listeners.
About how many episodes have you done now?
So we just recorded episode 10, which will come out on this Thursday, May the 7th. So 10 episodes in, everyone's had a little different style and flavor, a lot of great guests, and we're scheduled to tape episode 11 later this week too.
So are you doing it on a weekly cadence, or what's your plan for recording?
Yeah, we've got about a 2-week turnaround time. Generally, we've compressed that down to 7 or 8 days when we've needed to, and it's been a little bit longer when we've had some more time to plan. But what's our kind of view is record, listen, get a guest buy-in or PLI's buy-in, based on what they think it is over a couple days, refine, and then kind of have PLI put the kibosh on the niceties around the production, the music, the sound effects, some of the scoping. So we've got probably 3 episodes that are in a variety of pieces of development that are yet to be taped. Obviously, the one we've got this week is pretty close to being all set and ready to roll. And then we've got 3 or 4 episodes down the road that we're thinking about. broad-based topics with a couple of potential guests in mind. So it really is kind of whatever pops up. And thankfully, the team, between the work that I'm doing, in my practice as a forensic accountant, the work that Kurt does as a securities enforcement attorney, as well as the guys at PLI who have requests for knowledge and insight from their, again, 300,000 attorney members on an almost daily basis. We've kind of got this, cycle of discussion on a weekly basis. Say, okay, guys, we've got the next 2 episodes down. We're covered for a month. What are we going to want to talk about in July and August? Mm-hmm. We've kind of did, 2 weeks ago, episode 9, I believe, was our episode related to how, the coronavirus pandemic has kind of impacted our view. And we really thought we're not going to be able to update that in a meaningful way to people beyond just commenting on it once. The world is changing so fast and things are closing and reopening. I mean, having a 2-week lag time isn't going to give us a lot of time to touch base on COVID-19 issues again. So we're kind of focused on some of those broader discussions as we roll throughout the summer, because we think that's what's going to be most meaningful to the folks who are listening.
Yeah, 2 things. One of the things I just realized is this is maybe the first time that I haven't had a pretty focused conversation where we begin with small talk about how you're faring in this global pandemic, work from home, whatever. So I think that's just emblematic of how we're starting to come out on the other side of that. And secondarily, I would imagine planning the content would have to be some type of marriage between, foresight. Okay, to your point, what are we thinking about 2 months from now, 6 months from now? But then also, I guess, being flexible enough to follow what's going on and be responsive to things that may be relevant that weren't planned for. I don't think anybody in December was planning to, be talking about work from home,
exactly,
mass unemployment, infectious disease and global health, things like that, right? All of these things, but you adjust and you figure out a way to engage people based on where you think they're at.
Yeah, the other kind of timing issue that we come up against, I don't know if you're familiar, attorneys and accountants are very risk-averse people. So oftentimes we've got guest speakers or content we want to talk about that we need to get approved through the firms that we work for or through the guests that are going to speak. So I know we've got an episode lined up about probably 6 weeks from now. And our guest said, hey, I need to have a pretty solid idea of what I'm going to say out loud, because my firm is going to want to make sure that I'm in line with the current messaging from the firm and I'm not overstating anything and I'm not providing an opinion on cases that haven't settled yet. Kind of all those wonky issues that affect attorneys and accountants. So that's been one of those, hey, yeah, let's get on the phone, let's do it. And everyone's like, well, no, I really can't do that. I'm going to need to get approval from these 11 people before I even talk to you about potentially doing this kind of thing. So on the flip side of all of the, world related issues we're dealing with, there's some of those nuanced, bureaucratic type things that we're struggling with isn't the right word. We're taking into consideration as we try to roll out more episodes of the podcast.
Yeah, that to me in your industry, whether it be law practice or accounting or financial services, right? Financial advisors have to deal with this. Mm-hmm. General, we'll just call it general compliance is usually the biggest barrier to marketing. Forget about just creating content, but marketing the business, and that's really hard. So I got to imagine that the marketing team at PLI must be really jazzed that you guys are giving them that content that they can work with.
Yeah, it's it's kind of it's not to lean into some of the terrible business jargon we all fall apart of. It's a win-win. For example, PLI gets free content. Kurt and I are doing this because it interests us and we get excited about it and we're enthusiastic for it. And so PLI kind of walks away with a 45-minute podcast every 2 weeks that they can take to their membership. From a selfish perspective, Kurt and I get to talk to those 300,000 people, right? Whether they want to buy into it or not. We've got a platform where we can kind of talk about some of our experience and expertise. So if and when someone needs to, a consultant or an attorney to come and help them out, we're kind of on a list of people that they might have heard of before. So from a marketing perspective, that's really, one of the selfish reasons we're excited to do it.
What advice would you give for somebody who's in your situation, meaning they work in an industry that is heavily regulated, especially when it comes to marketing and content? What would you say to somebody in that industry that might be interested in either starting a podcast or producing their own content?
Yeah, I'll answer that 2 ways. The first being from the expert witness perspective. Part of serving as an expert in a court of law is to not only have the skills, knowledge, education, experience, and technical training to testify, but also your reputation and your professionalism over your career matters. For example, if you come out in a court case and say, first in, first out inventory accounting, FIFO accounting is the only way that this type of company should ever do their accounting, full stop, I'm an expert, I'm right, end of story, and you win that case, 15 years down the road, you might get asked to testify and present a case about last in, first out inventory accounting, LIFO accounting. And the attorney is going to be sitting on that opinion that you gave 15 years ago that says FIFO is the only way to do it, man. And say, were you wrong then or are you wrong now? Completely impeaching your credibility. So as an expert witness and in the litigation world, you always want to be conscious of what you're putting out into the world, because it might come back to you on the stand or in future discussions about potential sales opportunities or the ability to serve clients. Secondarily, in a general kind of content development perspective, one of my favorite maxims that I learned early on in my career from some of the great mentors I've had is admit when you are wrong or admit when you don't know. And I can tell you, admit when you were wrong is something that CJ Maurer, founder of The Gist, taught me in a Devereaux dorm room at St. Bonaventure campus many years ago. I won't tell you how many, because that's going to tell you how old we are. We had some trouble as men growing up in a sports environment, being able to talk about being incorrect and how that didn't make us less impressive. But when you're interacting in a public forum or in a social media or podcast setting, say, hey, I don't know that answer. I'd love to look it up, or tell me more, guest. I want to hear what you have to say about that, because, I'm generally aware of what you're talking about, but I don't know the details, and getting into those kind of educational conversations, whether it's for the other person who's looking into marketing or content production, or just from enhancing the level of understanding your audience might give. I mean, those are the best nuggets that I've heard from podcasts that I've been a part of, as well as listened to generally.
I think that's really great advice. And one of the things that it reminds me of is something that I think is really important right now too, on personal levels, when it comes to recent events or political stances or whatever. One of the things that I think is really virtuous is saying, I don't know enough about this issue to have an opinion on it.
Yeah.
Right. And I've seen that recirculating now that all of a sudden everybody went from, depending on, what side of the political spectrum you are. But a handful of months ago, there were a lot of, armchair constitutional law experts on Facebook. And now there's a lot of armchair, public health and infectious disease experts on Facebook. And what you just said, though, through the lens of producing content and protecting your credibility, professional reputation, I think it's something that all of us could use as a reminder, realizing that it is okay not to know something. There are plenty of things that are discussed in public forums that a lot of people have strong opinions about that I very comfortably don't, because I have not spent the time nor gained the expertise to have a qualified opinion in them. And I think that's a really good example.
Yeah, it's all that self-awareness. It's funny, on the street that my wife and I live on, we've got neighbors on either side of us that are also on either side of the political spectrum. And so one of my neighbors, when I go take the trash out, says, you know what, Chris, I really hope that there's a protest here in Washington, D.C. to get people to reopen things. What do you think? And I say, I don't really know if that's the best option for the people who live in the city or not. And then, my neighbor literally on the other side of our building here says, Chris, I don't really feel safe going back to work ever. It's going to be so different. What do you think? And I said, I don't really know. I understand where you're coming from, but there's a part of me that feels that way. And there's a part of me that thinks that, I'll be okay, going to the office that I went to, for months prior to the pandemic. So it's literally in between those two houses is kind of an interesting way. And I've had to admit to them, I don't really have a strong stance on where we sit from that perspective. So that self-awareness, I think, is super important.
I think everybody can agree that the ideal outcome is that everybody goes back to work and everybody is healthy and safe.
Yes, that's right.
when those two are at odds with each other, then there's a lot of unknowns. Hey man, I got to get going in a minute because it is Cinco de Mayo at this recording, and I have promised my family a full-fledged Mexican feast for dinner.
Excellent.
Which I have to start making soon. But I just wanted to say thank you again. I really hope that we can do this again someday. Thanks for sharing some information about what you do, your experience creating content, specifically, starting your podcast, which sounds awesome, and I can't wait to follow along. I really appreciate your just, general enthusiasm for for interesting topics. So thanks so much for your time. And, hopefully we can do this again soon.
I'm proud to be a part of it, CJ. Good luck as you continue on this journey. And, from one work husband to another, I know it's going to turn out great. So keep on keeping on.
All right, man. See ya.
Take care, everybody.